Alright everybody, welcome back to another video, and this one is going to be a little bit different because, well, I'm not talking about beer this time. Many of my viewers have mentioned to me that they've noticed this large collection of things that are not beer over here. I also know that plenty of my viewers are also people who really appreciate the other kinds of fine alcohols out there like whiskey. I figured I'd just break down some of my whiskey collection here and highlight some of the ones that I really enjoy and just talk about them. I'm certainly no Cicerone or sommelier. I don't really have a refined palate for this stuff. Whiskey is something I genuinely enjoy and appreciate. It's definitely second to beer in terms of how much I know about it. I'm not going to claim that I'm an expert on it either, but it's definitely something I also appreciate. Whiskey tends to be a very diverse and complex beverage. So I also figured I'd kind of shoot this video in terms of what is affordable and what is accessible to the average person. So none of my whiskey collection is anything particularly special. Most of my collection here is pretty much available in any liquor store in the United States, so it's nothing super special. I do have a couple very special individual bottles that I've picked up through travels or other special occasions, but they're not coming out tonight. If you're active on YouTube in the cooking/liquor department, I guess, of YouTube at all, you've probably heard of the channel Binging with Babish. It's a fantastic, primarily cooking channel, but the guy also breaks down some pretty awesome whiskey selections. However, it's kind of limited, it's kind of narrow, and I think he kind of is bought out by some of them. So some of my recommendations are actually shared with him because he was actually the person that got me thinking about kind of expanding the idea. I'm not just going to be limiting myself to the small number of whiskeys that was on that particular video. If you're interested, I'll link the video up here in the corner. Kind of gets you started on just a decent starter collection. Although I think the video was actually sponsored by Black Bush, which is one of the whiskeys that he mentions, and I am not a fan of that whiskey at all. Even though I have some, it's just not very pleasant for me, but that's a whole other thing. If you also want another fantastic reference in terms of history of whiskeys, go to How to Drink YouTube channel. It has a fantastic breakdown of every single kind of whiskey, and it is definitely a lot more information than I can give you here in this video. Alright, so we're going to work through a series of different kinds of whiskey. There's four main types that I'd like to cover here. The first is Irish whiskey, the second is Bourbon whiskey, third, Scotch whiskey, and the last one is Japanese whiskey. They're all slightly different from each other, and I think it's definitely not a bad idea to have at least one of each kind in your own collection if you can afford it. So we'll start out with Irish whiskey. There's definitely the popular Irish whiskeys like Jameson and Tullamore Dew. I'm not a fan of either of those. That's just my own personal flavor though. But I can recommend one in particular that is very good, and this is Knappogue Castle. So we're gonna go ahead and start with that and pour a little bit, and we'll taste it and talk about it. From what I understand, Irish whiskeys basically only have one rule, and that is that they have to be distilled and aged in Ireland. It's not necessarily required to age them in a specific kind of wooden barrel, but they just have to be aged for a minimum of 3 years, I believe. I had plenty of different Irish whiskeys before, and I find them a nice kind of enjoyable middle ground between bourbon and like a Scotch. Bourbon tends to be very oaky, and Scotch tends to be very malty and smoky and overpowering. Irish whiskey tends to be very much in the middle, where it's just a malt-forward, tasty, sweet kind of whiskey. So we're going to go ahead and go into the Knappogue Castle here. So Knappogue Castle is also a single malt Irish whiskey, which I don't seem to find very frequently, so I also found that interesting. So definitely not very sharp on the tongue. Goes down very easy, very drinkable. Lots of nice sweet and a good sweet kind of cereal-y malt character. It has a little bit of a corn taste to it, but that's not necessarily what it was made with. So here it says Knappogue Castle is an exceptional single malt Irish whiskey made exclusively from malted barley, so yeah, no corn. It's then triple distilled in copper pot stills and then aged in the finest bourbon oak casks for 12 years. The taste is fruity, clean, and mellow. Mellow, definitely true. Clean, definitely true. Fruity, I don't know. I get a little bit of vanilla, I think, from the bourbon cask finish, probably. There's a hint of it there. There's a little kind of the thing that's most apparent to me is just this really pleasant sweetness. And it's not a cloying sweetness, it's not a candy-like sweetness, it's definitely not an artificial sweetness, which you can sometimes get with things like Canadian whiskeys. I don't like Canadian whiskey. I've never had a single Canadian whiskey that I actually enjoyed. I'm not going to recommend any here on this video because of my personal preference. But sometimes they can tend to be an artificial candy-like sweetness to them that I just don't like. This doesn't have that. Very clean, very smooth, very middle of the road. Like, if you can't decide if you want the aggressiveness and oakiness of a bourbon or the smokiness and slaps you in the face character of a Scotch, this is kind of a great option for that middle of the road type thing. So, very drinkable, very tasty, and this is actually not too bad. I think this is around $50 per bottle. So, we'll let that sit there, and now we're going to go ahead and dive into the actual bourbons. Now, bourbon is a very popular type of whiskey, so I'm going to go ahead and actually go through several different bourbons here because I own several different bourbons. So bourbon has kind of more tight rules than Irish whiskey, and actually most whiskeys in general. It has to be made from at least a 51% corn mash bill. You can have other grains like rye and barley, but it has to be at least 51% corn. And the other rule is that it has to have contact, keyword, with fresh charred white American oak. Sometimes that means it is aged in fresh white American charred oak. Other times it means it's just rolled across it and put into a bottle. Either way, the liquid has to touch the wood, and that is the way that rule set works. I don't understand it. I don't really have the resources available to me to actually back up what I'm saying, but just that's what my understanding is. For the most part, if you age the whiskey in the oak, in the barrels, it just tastes better. So we're gonna go through two different bourbons, but I am gonna mention a third one, and that is the infamous Handle of Old Grandad that many of you have pointed out in my videos, which is now gone. But that is a bottom shelf bourbon that is probably your best value per dollar that you can get on a bourbon. It is actually very drinkable and actually pretty good. It's not necessarily my go-to, but for 25 bucks, it's a real cheap buy and actually is a pretty solid bourbon for what you're paying. It goes very well in any sort of bourbon cocktail you might make, like an old fashioned or a Manhattan. It's really good for that stuff because oftentimes with more expensive bourbons, you really just kind of want to have them straight or with a little bit of ice just to kind of appreciate them because they are expensive and they're also very well made and very interesting to drink. I'd rather not waste high-end bourbon in a cocktail, so I'd rather just grab a Handle of Old Grandad, which is still good bourbon, surprisingly, for its price, again, but I put that in the cocktail instead. But anyway, we're going to go with this. This is actually a very small craft distillery in upstate New York, near where I went to school. And this is actually some of the first fine spirits that I actually ever consumed. When I was 21, I went on tour of this place, and it just absolutely rocked my world because I just had no understanding that there was such a thing as good liquor. Because college was a mess with that stuff. Everyone's been through that. I don't need to explain it. Yankee Distillers is a very small batch place, and this bourbon here is actually a very young bourbon. This has only been aged, I believe, for 1 year. Yeah, it says aged for 1 year here, and then it's put in the bottle. So it ends up being a very different taste than most bourbons. If you've ever gone to a distillery, sometimes they'll give you white bourbon, which is unaged, and it hasn't actually even touched the white oak yet. But this is actually a pretty interesting study here because we're going to compare it to a different bourbon that has been aged for many years. Now, if you happen to be in the upstate New York, Albany area, you can find this in most liquor stores in that area for about 45 bucks. So right up front, one of the things you're going to notice is that this is one of those whiskeys that you don't really know is in your mouth until after you've swallowed it. It is that clean. It's got a really different character than the Irish whiskey. It's a lot less malty. It's a lot less barley-like. I would say Irish whiskey is probably the closest thing you can get to what would happen if you were to distill a standard grain bill from a beer without hops in it. But that's not something that I do, and so therefore I don't really have any knowledge about it. But anyway, back to the bourbon here. It's very, very clean, and the young whiskey has this kind of cool sweetness to it. Again, another theme here. Good, well-made liquors actually tend to be a little bit sweet, because that's actually the perception that good, clean alcohol will trick your brain into thinking that it's actually sweet. This is a very smooth oak flavor to it. It's a gentle oak. Obviously, it hasn't been aged for very long, so it's not actually like crazy oaky. There's a nice vanilla note to it, and no sort of like char coming through though. Ultimately, it is actually just a very easy drinking, not aggressive, not hot tasting whiskey. And it's an interesting case study into what bourbon is like before it ages for a while. All right, the next one we're going to go into is another bourbon called Angel's Envy. This is one of the ones that was recommended by Binging with Babish, and I'm glad I picked it up because it is actually really good. So we're going to go ahead and pour this one. Before I do, we're going to read it. It is Kentucky Straight Bourbon Whiskey, finished in port wine barrels. It is a 86 proof, so slightly higher. Unfortunately, there's no sort of indication as to how long it was aged, but simple color comparison here will show you that the Angel's Envy is actually much darker than the Yankee, and that is an indication that it was in either barrels with a higher char level or just a longer aging period. Now, this is actually one of my favorite bourbons, and you can pick this up for about $40, I think, for a bottle, and it's solid. Come to think of it, I've never tasted the Angel's Envy next to another bourbon, and now that I have, it's actually really cool because you can actually notice that contribution of the port wine barrels. There's a slight like plum note in here, which is really cool. So it's a little less aggressive, I think, up front, a little less sharp than the Yankee is, but it has a little bit more body to it. It has a little bit more substantial character. I don't think it has as hot of a finish. The other thing that's not there, or is slightly muted, actually, is oak character. So, yeah, I'm not really getting as much of an oak note as I am with the Yankee. Not that that's a bad thing, because this is actually a very complex whiskey. There's a lot more flavor coming through on this one, I think, than there was with the Yankee, and it has to do with the aging period that was involved in this one, I think. And also the idea of finishing it in a different barrel. You'll see a lot of different liquors kind of doing that, and it's the same idea of putting a imperial stout in a bourbon barrel. You pick up those little subtle nuances, this is actually really cool. Now, I've never tasted it next to another bourbon, so there's a lot more vanilla coming out of this too. And dare I say, a little bit of orange. Ultimately, I think this one ends up being a bit smoother and a bit rounder. You give this bourbon to somebody who's used to like Jack Daniels, you're just going to completely change their life. I will absolutely be refreshing this bottle as soon as I'm done, because I'm not that far away from being done. As you can tell, it's one of my favorites. I really enjoy it. Definitely goes well on the rocks too. Another honorable mention for a good whiskey that I'm not going to taste right now because I don't want to get too messed up tonight is Woodford Reserve. It's very common mid-range whiskey you'll see very frequently, and it is a high distribution whiskey, but it holds its own against most bourbons. I would say the Angel's Envy is probably a bit better in my opinion, but this is still definitely a very good whiskey. Now we're going to go on to what is arguably my favorite kind of whiskey, and that is Scotch whiskey. I have probably more scotches than any other kind of whiskey, and I've gone through more scotches than any other kind of whiskey. There's just a tremendous variety within the world of scotch, and a tremendous amount of different results, different things that you can get out of them. I think they're the most complex of any whiskey, aside from Japanese whiskey, I think. But it is also a very particular kind of whiskey that can turn people off very quickly because its flavors are aggressive and they're just not necessarily well received by everybody unless they have a taste for that sort of thing. And it's definitely an acquired taste. I don't blame you for hating Scotch the first time you try it. It tastes like crap until you realize that it tastes amazing. Something to keep in mind is that everyone's palate changes over time, and as they drink more of a certain type of thing or taste more of a certain type of thing, it will evolve, and you end up actually getting different kinds of appreciation for different flavors that come out more, and some of those bitter or smoky or just weird tasting flavors tend to take a background note to the more subtle intricacies of these things. But I'm digressing and I am babbling because I am 3 whiskeys down out of 7. So let's go ahead for number 4. We're going to go into another Babish recommendation, the Lagavulin 8-year. Now this is a Scotch that comes with a warning from me. This Scotch tastes like a tire fire. So if you end up buying this because you think you're Ron Swanson and you've never had a Scotch before, you're going to have a bad time. This is probably the palest of any of these liquors, which is interesting, but it is an 8-year-old Scotch. So don't let that color fool you. Scotch whiskey, basically, in my understanding, just has to be produced in Scotland. There's no rule really about what it has to be made from, but traditionally it will be very regional. So there's different parts of Scotland that are famous for different whiskeys. There's a couple of big players there. Speyside as well as Islay Scotches are both very common and very distinctive. Scotch whiskey can have a lot of different variations. You can have Scotches like this one, which are going to be heavily peated, which means that they're going to taste like smoke or rubber. So the dominant flavors in Scotch whiskeys range from peaty and smoky to rubber to briny to floral as well as medicinal. So right now, currently, I'm kind of going through phases because initially when I started having Scotch, I opened my world with it with Talisker Storm, which is that's a smoky boy. I don't recommend starting your experience out with something like that. I recommend starting with a very particular kind of Scotch, and that is Glenmorangie 10-year. Glenmorangie 10-year is a very gentle Scotch. It's more on that floral end of things, and it's actually a real easy drinker, and it's affordable. You can get a 750 milliliter bottle of Glenmorangie 10-year for about $35 at every liquor store in the country, and it is a solid Scotch. It's a very enjoyable Scotch, and I unfortunately don't have one with me right now because otherwise I'd be busting it out because it's worth talking about. But if you're just getting into Scotch, that is probably the one that I recommend first. If you like the Glenmorangie, I'd follow that up with either a Macallan or a Glenfiddich. Those are a bit more expensive, but they're both very good Scotches. I find the Macallan a bit more buttery, but the Glenfiddich is kind of like a nicer version of the Glenmorangie. Anyway, we're gonna go in for the Lagavulin, which normally I would add a little bit of water to this to kind of break it down a little bit because it is a very intense Scotch. So, but it is very good. Once you have some time to actually sit back and think about it, appreciate it, and just actually, devote some brain power to actually drinking as opposed to just drinking the damn thing, it's actually really good. So it's a great combination of a brininess with a really, really intense peatiness. And it finishes with this charred note, as well as kind of a little bit of a rubberiness. It's kind of infamous for tasting like a tire fire, but it is actually really enjoyable once you get the hang of it. Really very complex and totally different from any other whiskey I've had here today. It is absolutely something else. They have a 16-year version as well, which is definitely a little bit more mellowed out. This thing's kind of a beast. Similar whiskeys to this would also be like an Ardbeg. There's a couple different variations of Ardbeg. I have been blessed to have had the chance to have an Ardbeg 20-something, 23-year at a Scotch tasting. That is a $700 bottle of Scotch. That is actually very similar to this, but it's just a glorious combination of mellowed peaty notes, and that is just simply the oldest aged anything that I've ever drank, and it's mind-blowingly good. But anyway, this is an 8-year-old Scotch, which is pretty young by the standards of Scotch. It also doesn't have as much heat to it until the very end, where there's actually this really cool combination of just charred flavor in combination with the heat that makes it really good. I'm really not selling this whiskey very well. You gotta kind of be a Scotch person to appreciate this one, because I guarantee you, if it's the first time that you actually drink a Scotch and you drink a Lagavulin 8-year, you're gonna have a bad time. But once you kind of get into the nuances of the style, it's actually really interesting. But anyway, I'm gonna stop deliberating on that because I'm going and going and going, and we're gonna go in for a different Scotch. That is Talisker Classic 10-year. This is probably my all-time favorite Scotch, I think. Like I said, I initially started on Scotch with Talisker Storm, which is a little bit different than Talisker, the regular Talisker. This is more of a high-end whiskey, I'd say. It's around the same price as the Lagavulin, so about 65 to 70 bucks a bottle. But it's worth it. Talisker isn't going to have that intense peatiness that you get from the Lagavulin. It's going to be a little bit more restrained, and I think this classic version is kind of more a good introduction to high-end Islay Scotches. Talisker is pretty famous for being the only distillery on the Isle of Skye, but it does a solid job for having pretty much no regional competition. So we're going in for the Talisker. Oh yeah. So right away, obviously, it's not as aggressive and peaty and in your face and on fire as the Lagavulin is. This is a much more refined tasting Scotch. It has a little bit more of a malty character to it. It's a little more complex. Your flavor ranges all over the place out of this one. You get a little bit more saltiness, I think, coming out of this. It's an extremely smooth whiskey up front, and it's very, very flavorful. It's not anything like these bourbons where it wasn't really noticeable until halfway through, but this is a whiskey that is in you. It lets you know it's there, but it's not aggressive. It's more refined, it's more smooth, it's more stable. There's a kind of subtle butteriness to it, and there's so many different flavors that are coming from this. It is quite the evolution. It does have a bit of peatiness to it, and that is kind of a characteristic, but it doesn't have anything like the level that's in the Lagavulin. Granted, I just tasted the Lagavulin earlier, so I might be just wiping out my palate entirely. But this is a very, like I said, this is probably my all-time favorite Scotch. It has a tremendous amount of flavor and a tremendous amount of offerings of what Scotch can be all throughout the evolution of its flavor. So what's present in the Talisker that wasn't present in the Lagavulin as much is kind of that same character that was in the Irish whiskey, the sort of cereally malty character in the mid-range, and that fades into peat. It's not really, the peat character, the smoky character, is not necessarily the center of the experience like it was for the Lagavulin. And that's one of the reasons why I like it. It just has so much to offer. Alright, so now for our third and final Scotch of the evening. That's going to be Laphroaig 10-year. Laphroaig and Lagavulin are both Islay Scotches, but Laphroaig, I think, has a more restrained and more interesting flavor profile than the Lagavulin does. It's also a little bit more approachable. It's definitely the least aggressive of all three of these Scotches that I've tried tonight, and therefore can probably be served to somebody who's interested in experiencing a peaty-ish Scotch. Second to last whiskey type for the evening, so let's see if I can make it through to the end without becoming an incoherent, stumbling drunk. Oh, that's cool. Alright. You know, I've actually never gone ahead and sat down with my favorite parts of my whiskey collection and tasted them one after the other. So it's actually really fun to be able to compare all of them together and just see the differences between each type of whiskey. And just like I had with the Angel's Envy versus the regular bourbon that I had, the Laphroaig versus the other two Scotch is totally different. This is right away a lot more charred. It's like less of a peaty smoke flavor and more of a campfire roasted smoke flavor. And it's not intense. It's extremely gentle, which is it's not something I would expect to say when describing a roasted charred flavor. But believe me, it is actually pretty gentle. Again, it's rather briny. I think I'm kind of developing an affinity for briny scotches. It's got this really gentle, buttery smoothness. Again, I'm using the word buttery because, I mean, it's kind of accurate. But it has this really interesting, very different charred, smoky flavor. I think the Talisker is a little bit less smoky than the Laphroaig and the Lagavulin, but this is also one of my favorites. It's probably my second favorite Scotch after the Talisker, for the most part. It's just a very smooth, gentle, non-aggressive, but very different and interesting type of Scotch. It's mostly briny, a little bit smoky, and it's not as malty as the Talisker. It's not as complex as the Talisker, but it's not as aggressive as the Lagavulin, and it doesn't have that like really divisive peaty flavor. It's a different kind of smoke. That's another one that's really good when you put a little bit of water into it. Last and greatest. Notice I didn't say last but not least. This is last but greatest. Japanese whiskey. So, actually, before I pour this, because I need some time. Japanese whiskey comes with a bit of a cultural caveat. I think it's still kind of an emerging thing coming into the Western markets. Japanese whiskey is an exceptional thing because there's a culture associated with craftsmanship and improvement in Japan. So basically, in the United States, in the United States and in most Western nations, the ideology is you have a good thing, okay, cool, let's sell it. You know, it's a good thing, everybody knows it's a good thing, therefore we can make money off of it. Which is all well and good, I'm all for capitalism. But in the Japanese culture, when you have a good thing, it doesn't necessarily mean you're done. The next step is to make that better. You have a good thing, you understand what you're doing right, what you're doing wrong, and then you change something. Does that work? Does it make it better? Yes? Okay, then we keep that piece and we figure out what we can continue to improve. If it doesn't work, we throw it away, we do something different. The culture of Japanese whiskey has basically gotten us to a point where you have a bottle of whiskey that is the best bottle of whiskey that could be produced by that distillery to this point. And in the future, there's probably some small tweak or process improvement or recipe change that has made it better. Japanese whiskey will never get worse in the future. It will never stay stagnant in the future. It will continue to evolve and improve over time, and that's what kind of makes it so special. This is the third and final recommendation from Babish that I picked out for myself, and this is the Nikka coffee grain whiskey. Coffee not referring to coffee the beverage, but it's actually a type of mill, believe it or not. But I'm not going to get into that because I don't know enough about it to speak intelligently about it. But this, I can assure you, is A, my most expensive bottle of whiskey, and B, probably the best bottle of whiskey that I have on this entire shelf. Japanese whiskeys tend to kind of follow along with scotches a little bit, but it's not as peaty, and it's a little bit more refined. We're going to go ahead and just sit this down, think about it, and talk about it. And this is thankfully my last bottle of whiskey to go through tonight. Because even with these tasters, it gets to you. All right. But we're going to need more than that. Because, you know, special occasion whiskey, right? And shooting this video is kind of a special occasion. I might as well have enough to be able to digest it. Wow. So for reference, that's about 80 bucks a bottle. And it's worth it. How do I even do justice to this thing? So it starts out with a nice, sweet, cereally, malty start, which has notes of vanilla and raisin. I'm getting raisin, yep. As well as a little bit of a subtle fruitiness. And that moves into more of a... is that an oakiness, or is that just wood-aged character? It has this kind of marshmallow note, too, which is... it's weird. But it's cool. This is another one of those sweet whiskeys, or sweet perceived whiskeys, that it comes down to being a finely distilled alcohol. So even though it is kind of made the same way as scotches and draws its heritage from scotches, it actually is not that similar to the scotches that I tasted tonight. I'd say it shares more similarity with the gentler, more floral scotches like the Glenmorangie and the Glenfiddich. What I think is probably the defining characteristic of this whiskey is just the sheer way, is just the way that it is so freaking smooth and mellow. There's a nice balance that is struck between being smooth and mellow enough that it doesn't, like, you know, burn you when you take a sip, but also doesn't just disappear on your tongue. And I think this is the reason why I made this the last whiskey I would taste, is because it has a little bit of everything in it. It has that cereally maltiness of the Irish whiskey. It has vanilla notes and wood-aged characteristics of bourbon whiskey. And it has a little tiny bit, that's the touch, of that kind of brininess and peculiar character of Scotch whiskeys. And add to that the idea that it has been distilled under the most careful of conditions and in a culture that values quality over quantity. I think that makes it a very high value and quality product. It is a fine whiskey, and it is among one of the best whiskeys that I have ever had in my entire life. When this bottle goes away, I will happily replace it with another. It is absolutely worth the money that I paid for it. This is the whiskey that, you know, everybody's got one. This is the whiskey that I save and I rarely drink. It's the one that I break out only for the special occasions, only for the special guests, and, you know, for the YouTube videos. But it really is that special occasion whiskey. Everybody needs one. And this makes a fine one. It's an outstanding whiskey with a tremendous amount of complexity to it. And totally different from the other three types that we tasted here tonight. So, anyway, that is it. Anyway, I think that's going to be it for the evening. Once again, I do not claim to be a whiskey expert. I don't know that much about this stuff, but I do know that I enjoy it. And these are my recommendations for you. There is a lot to experience in the world of whiskey, and I think it is just as interesting as beer can be. While beer and brewing might be the main focus of this channel, it's definitely worth diving into some offshoots, you know, for fun. So this was kind of one of those. Thanks for joining me on this. I do appreciate your support. If you like the video, please hit the like button. And normally I will make grain to glass brewing videos where I take a beer all the way from start to finish in the same video. And if you like that sort of content, please hit the subscribe button. If you want to talk whiskey, if you want to talk beer, either one's fine. Please do comment down below. I will get back to you as soon as I can. Do read every single comment, and I do appreciate it quite a bit. If you're interested in seeing more content like that, in addition to subscribing, I also have an Instagram, which is at the Apartment Brewer on Instagram, as well as a Patreon, which I'm linking here in the corner. So go check out either of those, or both, if you want more additional content. The Patreon has a lot more video content, and the Instagram has more image content, obviously. So once again, this video is totally not sponsored by any of these brands of whiskey. I'm not nearly that popular. This is just an unbiased opinion on what I like, so hopefully you do check out some of these for yourselves. Let me know if you like any of them or hate any of them. It's actually completely understandable. It's a wide variety of flavors here. But anyway, I digress. I will catch you guys in the next one, which is going to be a brewing video, and I will catch you guys then. I'm going to go get some water, so until then, cheers.